To wrap up this module, let's review some of the common terms that are associated with using a function. And let's also practice writing some function calls. First, let's see if we can guess what to fill in this blank. Information passed into a function are referred to as the blank of the function. When you're calling a function, what's the information that you pass in called? The information that's passed into a function is called the arguments of the function. Each function is allowed to have 0 arguments, in other words, no information required, or as many arguments as you want. There's no limit. Let's look at this next one. Information passed back from a function to the main program is referred to as the function's other piece of data that we need to know in order to use a function successfully is what's the expected return value. It's the information that the function communicates back to the program that you're creating. Suppose I want to call a function called calculate this. The documentation tells me that the function requires 2 arguments that represent 2 integer values that need to be the operands in some mathematical function. The purpose of the function itself is that it calculates the result of this particular calculation and returns the value. What would be a valid function call for the calculate this function? To pick the correct syntax for the function call, we need to establish whether this function returns a value or not. In the function description, it tells us that the function calculates a result and returns that value. So we know that this function does have a return value. We also need to know the name of the function, and we're told that's called calculate this. And we need to know how many arguments there are for the function and what those arguments represent. In this case, they're 2 integer values. So a function call to the function calculate this might look like result equals calculate this, the name of the function, and then we need to pass in our 2 argument values. We can call them whatever we want. Value 1 and value 2 might be good choices. And again, this function call communicates to Python that we're calling a function called calculate this, that the function is supposed to use these 2 bits of information, value 1 and value 2. It should make its calculation, and then it should store the result in our variable called result. Let's do one more function call example. Suppose I want to call a function called print this, and the function requires 3 arguments that represent strings that should be displayed. In this case, the function doesn't make any calculations or return a value. What would a valid function call to the print this function look like? So again, you have to think about those 3 pieces of information. What's the return value? What's the name of the function? And finally, what are the arguments? This function's description tells us that there is no return value, so we're not going to need to use the assignment operator in this function call. Instead, we'll begin with the name of the function, which is print this, and we want to pass in 3 different arguments, which represent strings to display. Might be string 1, string 2, and string 3. My 3 pieces of information that I'm going to provide to the function so that it can carry out its algorithm. At this point, you should understand how functions facilitate abstraction in code, understand the proper syntax required to make function calls. You've seen example functions in the Python library and know how to call those functions, and you know what the term argument and return value mean in the context of calling a function.